This meeting is being recorded.
All right, everybody, welcome to this year's Lit Chat model, the much new and updated version. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mr. Landis. I'm one of our ERWC teachers, and I will be handling the psychological lens of Brave New World and analysis.
And if you don't know me, I am Mr. Hadley, one of the ERWC teachers, and I will be attacking Brave New World through the formalist lens today.
I'm Christina Ray, the third ERWC teacher, and I will be tackling it through a sociological lens.
What will be fun for you in class as you view this is to put the three teachers in age order. It's a surprising result.
Wow.
Now, that being said,
Wow.
I want to jump right in, and I'm going to hit this one on the head. And if you see me off screen, I'm hit with my prep doc. I thought about this today and is working through, specifically within psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the great pyramid that's defined the self-actualization of humanity for, I don't know what, the last 50 years or so. And the idea is at the base of it, you feel your most basic needs, food, shelter, and as you start to progress to belonging, to religion, to intimacy, until you become a self-actualized person, which we define as the realization of one's fulfillment. And as I started to look through this thing, I really started to ask a question, and actually not so much a question as a theory I want to throw out there. I think Huxley promotes, whether satirically or hyperbolically, the idea that the degradation of humanity is the only thing that allows self-actualization. So in a very, let's get this down to layman's terms. In chapter 16, when he's having the conversation with John the Savage, and he's talking about well, if we had an alpha created man doing epsilon level work, it would drive him mad. He would be unhappy. His needs wouldn't be being met. And the same for an epsilon man who would feel inferior his whole life. And we won't talk about the fact that it's only men who can work in this society, apparently. But more so, the idea, it almost seems like through the voice of Mustafa Mond, Huxley is proposing the idea that by damaging people or by suppressing people, you can actually self-actualize them. You can, if you limit their destiny, they're always capable of fulfilling it and always happy. And I was curious what your thoughts were.
Well, who's happy?
To him, and the society is.
Right, to him, but is that simply Mustafa Mond's unwillingness to see the reality? I guess the word happiness, because it's such a huge part of this, last couple chapters of the book, right? This idea of happiness exists because there's no truth and beauty. But are any of these people happy? Ray, you look like you had something you wanted to jump in with.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because I don't know, when you think about Maslow's pyramid, and then you think not only of what he wants, what Mond wants society to look like, and what he's saying would be the ideal man and the ideal view of happiness compared to what John experiences, two very different things. But there's a theory that Adam Smith developed that's called rational choice theory, which is one of the deviant theories. So it's part of conflict theory. It falls under that overall branch, but it essentially says that everything that we do in order to feel successful or feel like we fit into our society or that we're meeting our own needs, so kind of relates back to Maslow, is based on extrinsic cost benefit analysis that we do. And that's how we approach every decision that we make. And so intrinsic things like happiness have literally no place when it comes to determining our role in society and what would push us to deviance and things like that. It's essentially one of the things that the theory talks about is when it looks at crime and it looks at strain theory, and if we look at what's going to make us feel like we've succeeded in that cost benefit, things like guilt for committing a crime don't even come into play. So what Adam Smith would argue is that this whole argument of happiness or not, it doesn't matter as long as you're fulfilling your role in society. And so that means fulfilled. And so that would in Maslow's hierarchy of need, there is no happiness. Like, why does self-actualization have to be related to happiness? We just apply that meaning to it because we can't help but apply meaning to things. But like in this society, maybe not. And maybe that's why John is so miserable that he's driven to suicide, is because he's focused too much on those things that actually don't have a place in the society, like happiness.
Oh, and I think there's a lot that you can get to with this, what I've started to call the subversion of John's pyramid within the Maslow hierarchy. But I'm gonna push you a little bit here, Ms. Ray, to clarify that point, because I can't tell if you were on my side with that or not.
I don't know that I don't think I am, because if you're saying that their society is happy based on what Monda's saying, I'm saying it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, probably not. They feel actualized, yes, because according to that rational choice theory, they are experiencing success. And the intrinsic things, the intrinsic factors are not even coming into play if this is the theory and the lens you look at it through. So all right, so theories are wild, but I enjoy them.
So like let's narrow that down a little bit, and then I'll yield the floor so somebody else can talk. Let's put this in a drastic comparison. Everybody's aware that the Los Angeles Dodgers cannot play baseball in October. They're terrible at it. And every season for LA looks like a failure because they cannot win the World Series. But realistically, if we removed postseason competition completely, if there was no ultimate prize at the end of baseball season for them to lose, they would probably be the best team in baseball every year record-wise. Wouldn't that fulfill their potential? So realistically, bring this back to Brave New World, by removing the idea that you could have a greater potential, are you allowing them to become self-actualized and making it a measurable thing?
I think in this culture, yes. And then when you bring in someone who's not a member of that society and try to hold them to the same standards and ideals, and then you have them so completely miserable and unstable because they have that outside perspective. So I think that if your entire society is situated and set up and designed, right? Because it's intentional design on this society. If it's designed in order to do that and in order to limit what one can do, then if you come in from that outside perspective, yeah, it's awful, right? Like he's throwing up and he says, I ate civilization. I think it's like chapter, 17, 16 that happens.
Should be right now, right?
He can't digest it, literally and figuratively, can't digest what's happened and what he's been pushed into, because it's not how he defines his own self-actualization, because he's not been raised in a way where he's been conditioned to do so. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I think I've got it. I don't know that there is an answer whether it's right or wrong, but it almost seems in a way, and probably satirical because we know the whole novel is meant to be at a certain level. It almost seemed like Huxley's answer to depression and to the lack of self-worth was, well, just limit your potential.
Oof. But I don't know. I guess I'm struggling with, if all of the, like, if in the society happiness doesn't matter, and that all that matters is the value you bring. My train of thought's been derailed. I'm having a hard time thinking about, like, if all of this stuff doesn't matter, then they shouldn't need to push Soma on people, because they wouldn't even need that vacation. And also, then how do you account for Marx what happens when people do step out, right? If the society functions the way it's supposed to, then no one would step out because they're fulfilling their duty to the society. So why do they have to ship people off to islands if this thing is actually working? I guess is my question there.
Which I think is fair. And when you say Marx, we're referring to Bernard, correct?
Yes.
I mean, for the first third of the novel, I was rooting for Bernard. I really was. And then it made me laugh that when Ray pointed out, she's like, you're going to hate him in about 3 chapters. And I think I watched my students go through that as well. But after concluding the book, I don't know that the society is not working for him. He just had to learn to make it work for him. Mm-hmm. And what did he do? He limited the fact that he felt, well, he found comfort in the arms of others is the way I'll address that, and found a way to manipulate the society for himself. As far as the Soma thing goes, I think I'm going to go with the Snoop Dogg argument here. He's one of the greatest record sellers of all time. He's one of the godfathers of West Coast hip hop. And Snoop Dogg is more than known for his own version of Soma. So a self-actualized person can still imbibe, would be the term I would use.
All right.
Because I don't think Soma is being used as a tool to make people happy. I think it's used as a tool for control, which is what other Karl Marx would argue is constantly happening, is that if you are ruled by and I'm going to use my favorite word, hegemony, that exists within your society that controls those means of production, and the people like Mustafa Mond who are at that very top of that iceberg that he talks about, it's not about happiness. It's about keeping society functioning. It's about consumerism. It's about needing that constant consumption that exists in their society. And it's like conflict theory meets structural functionalism in that way. And so the Soma isn't to make people happy. The Soma is to control people.
Right. But they're pushing it on people the second they start to think that things aren't working. And if society was actually working the way it's supposed to, they wouldn't need that. I guess
there's no need for a tool to fix it if it's not broke.
Yeah. So it's clearly not working if they have to continue to push Soma on people to control them. If the society was actually working as they would want it to, they wouldn't have to fake control. They wouldn't have to push control on people.
But they don't give a shit about happiness, right? So like if working the way they want it to, it is working the way they want. They don't want people to feel happy. They want they're filling their roles in society.
I have now separated the idea of happiness and Soma. They're using Soma to control, but if society was actually functioning the way it's supposed to, they wouldn't have to do that. There wouldn't be a need to control people if they were actually doing the thing that if everything was working the way it was supposed to, there wouldn't even be a need for that.
But they're not forced to take Soma. They're conditioned to take it, right? It's just part of the way that they're designed.
I would push back that being conditioned from birth to take it isn't being forced to take it.
Isn't.
I think that if you're conditioning people from birth to take Soma, then I think you are forcing Soma on them. Even if it's a passive force, I think you're still forcing that on them.
But why is that? Why would that then say that it means society is not working for them, or that this design didn't pan out?
Because they wouldn't need it if it was actually functioning. If it was actually working the way it was supposed to, there wouldn't be a need for that kind of substance to control people, I guess.
But I don't think Soma is a solution to the problem. I think Soma is it's the baseline, right? Like, I don't think Soma exists to solve anything. Like, it's not like there was a problem, let's solve it by developing this thing. I think in their society, Soma is like a prerequisite for the society in the first place, right? I think it's like cart before horse almost with the Soma to the stability. Like, I think that stability doesn't exist because of Soma. Soma exists because of stability, or vice versa.
In the interest of making sure that we can all hit theories and everything, as much as I love this and I love derailing a conversation whenever I can, I think I got to push us in another direction, because there's still one more I want to get to. But once again, in the interest of being a good group member, I think I would like to hear more about formalism and see where we are there, because it's just not something I'm overly familiar with.
All right, so I want to talk about Shakespeare. And it's a struggle for formalism to tackle illusions, because the idea of formalism is you stay in the text and you don't think about anything outside of the text. So as I'm rereading chapters 16 through 18, I personally am trying to just ignore Shakespeare, but it becomes impossible in these last three chapters, right? We've got the Tempest, we've got Othello being a huge part. I think there's a King Lear quote in these last couple of chapters. There's references to Romeo and Juliet. So I can't ignore that. So then as a formalist, the next best thing I can do is try to ignore everything I know about Shakespeare and just think about Shakespeare in the text. Mm-hmm. What does this text tell me Shakespeare is? Through these I'm going to admit, this is a half-baked idea that is born out of, oh, what's his name? Hold on, let me find it. I have his name in here somewhere on a Post-it. William Epson, who kind of pioneered American formalism. Yes, I've moved away from Russian formalism. I apologize to all of those hardcore Russian formalist students listening out there. But they talked about new criticism as kind of a new formalist method. And so John the Savage uses, or I guess really it's Huxley, uses Shakespeare as shorthand for just art and beauty in general. And if I didn't know who William Shakespeare was, I think if you read this text, you would still be able to understand that he is standing in for kind of all art and beauty. I've called it capital A art. And so Shakespeare, if we use the grammatical term correctly, it's metonymy. Shakespeare is standing in for all of art. And so I've been trying to, as I was listening to y'all talk about happiness and soma and self-actualization, I was trying to find a way to tie all of this into it, and I couldn't find a way. So maybe one of the two of you through this can. How are we supposed to tie this idea of Shakespeare and art to the Savage and to what Huxley is trying to make meaning out of the difference between science and art? Does that make any sense at all?
I think it does. I definitely can work through an answer on the first one. So I'm going to take that and leave Ray with the second one. If I'm not mistaken, the one he alludes to the most often is the Tempest. It's the most common what he alludes to. And I think for John, there's a reflection there. Forgive me, it's been a little while since I've seen the Tempest. It's been even longer since I've read it. But if I'm not mistaken, Tempest runs around Prospero, causes the storm, and Caliban is part of the Tempest, correct?
Yeah.
And Caliban ends up becoming an alcoholic, and that becomes the god he worships, essentially. Because the feeling that the alcohol can provide for him is what leads to his eventual downfall. And I think the reason John goes into that so often is because it is a reflection for him. Because as much as this society has taken soma and made it their own, John is looking for something to vindicate him for a God to believe in, and this society doesn't have one for him. And even his old society rejected the idea of his. When the first time we meet John, he wants to be part of the ceremony, and he feels like he could have done a better job at the ceremony. But I think for me, the reason Shakespeare comes back to John so much is that Tempest connection. And then it goes further with the Romeo and Juliet. As everybody knows, Romeo and Juliet, it really isn't a great romance. It's more about two idiot kids who couldn't do things right because they didn't belong in the area they were in. And I think you can see some reflections of John and Lenina there. A man who is in love, but doesn't know how to quite get there. And that love turns violent and ends with corpses yet again.
Interesting.
I feel like Shakespeare in the text is John's attempt to make meaning, right? And I think part of the irony of Huxley choosing Shakespeare is that it's something that feels so over the heads for so many. And I know that, Shakespeare, obviously British. And so perhaps Brits who were reading this text when it initially came out would be more familiar. But even then, I feel like Shakespeare at the time was still shrouded in this, this is for academia. And so I think it was almost just like an irony of, because the science and the society itself is so over John's head, he's going to use the only thing that he really truly understands, which is Shakespeare, because it's what he had access to when he had started reading. And so it's not necessarily about the art or the beauty. I think it's about the exposure. But then when he has that, there's a moment in chapter, I think it's 18, where that photographer approaches him and he flips out on him. Notice that at that point, it's not Shakespeare that comes out of his mouth. It's the native language of Zuni, right? That's when we see that is what comes. And so I think that it's almost like this consistent use of Shakespeare isn't necessarily representing this idea of art. And I know it would, be contrary to his whole, I want poetry, I want beauty, but it's just the way that he's able to make meaning in his world.
And to build off that, in chapter, I don't know what chapters these things are anymore. I think it's 16 because it's kind of towards the front when Mustafa Mond even mentions the word science. John can't even fathom it because it says Shakespeare never mentioned science. And so I think that does kind of lend credence to your idea that whether or not it's beauty, art, it's making meaning, which for a formalist, that's all that words are meant to do, is to make meaning without thinking about anything else. It's really just the words that give us the meaning. So I think that works really, really well with that. So I like that. Thank you, Ray.
It's like what Mond says, people believe in God because they've been conditioned to believe in God. It's just, it's what you're trained to do. It's your lens of exposure and the meaning that you bring to a thing.
Yeah.
I think, and this was the other point I wanted to get to that I referenced earlier, the subversion of John's pyramid. If we go back to Maslow's hierarchy, John's pyramid is jacked up. It's in the wrong order. He doesn't belong in this society. He doesn't have the necessary shelter. Yes, he has a physical standing structure, but even his one true human connection, the only one he ever navigated semi-right, was with Linda. And Linda is so disconnected from her own pyramid that she can't get back to it. And I specifically looked at the moment in the apartment between John and Lenina where he's about to experience a connection, which I actually had to look up. Where does intimacy and sex fall into Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And it's the second or third level in a societal one. John's fundamental needs aren't met though. And now he's picking and choosing pieces. He understands the answer, but not the equation. And he tells her whore, impudent strumpet, and he had a tremulous voice. He's scared of his own anger. And he says, push his way, get out of my sight, or I'm going to become, I will kill you. There's no options there. And if we talk about becoming self-actualized, like John does want to present himself to be, and he wants to make meaning out of these things, and he wants the connections with Caliban, he wants the connections with Shakespeare. His own pyramid is so subverted, he's doomed from the minute he left the reservation. In fact, he's probably doomed the minute he stepped on the reservation to begin with. He's doomed in both worlds. He's a man with no country, no home. And by missing that fundamental level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, by missing those physiological ones, you can see him struggle to progress in everything else. He's not capable of friendship, of intimate connection, and he struggles to understand the way he loves the woman who is supposed to be his mother.
Not to steal your psychological thunder, but I mean, attachment theory perfectly explains John the Savage. He's like the poster child for an attachment disorder because of the relationship that he has with his mother throughout his youth because of her dependence upon alcoholism. Like he was never able to form those healthy attachments, which then affected his, development and ability to form relationships in the future.
And we can go back to Linda with that. You can go back to Linda with her struggle to attachment and her dependence on alcohol and intimate action to make herself feel it. Her pyramid, once she leaves the brave new world, is just as messed up as his is. They're trying to plug these things out and can't find any success. For her, alcohol, which should not be a physiological need, I think would be closer to a societal one if you were going to put it anywhere on the pyramid. She's trying to jump 2 or 3 things. And we see both times that Huxley removed the physiological needs for these people. You can even go back to Bernard. Bernard does not want to go to that island. He's panicked because you're removing the safety and security and you're ending relationships, which I think is Huxley ultimately wants to show that once you don't belong anywhere, you're screwed. Also, Freud would have had a field day.
Well, Robert K. Morton would have lost his mind over John the Savage as well. He's like the true deviant is the one who's able to achieve retreatism, where you just like reject society's norms, values, and means to achieve them and achieve that success and just say like F society and fully pull away. And I think by John flipping, he like intentionally flips his pyramid too at the end there when he's like, he wants no comfort. He wants nothing. He doesn't even want like the slightly synthetic food that's going to have better nutritional value. Like he wants to pull every single thing away to make sure that he is as miserable as possible. And then we add to that like the purging through the mustard and the warm water and the whipping. And even with all of that, Huxley hits us with just this moment where it's like, you tried so hard, but even your authentic suffering is turned into this synthetic, mass-produced feelie to be consumed as yet another means to control a population.
He was the Kardashians in the Brave New World. We were laughing at the Schadenfreude, the misery.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I kind of, there's all those juxtapositions, right? All the way through this book. And that's just, it just kind of almost ends on another one of these things that don't, these ideas, like you're talking about authentic and synthetic, right? Those two things shouldn't be able to work together. But Huxley has filled this entire book to the brim of juxtapositional ideas, juxtapositional phrases. This one I love in chapter 17, you can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. This idea of pleasant vices, and like you think of like what, well, we can all think of vices that are plenty pleasant. They're not, like when you think the word vice, it's supposed to be a wicked or immoral behavior. And so it makes it feel like pleasant and vices shouldn't be able to go together. Yet they're like freely having people indulge these vices.
They're symbiotically linked at this point.
That's the only way that a society can last, is if you have vices and instead of fighting them, they're like, here, orgy porgy. Here, soma, right? All of this idea that's wrapped up in this juxtaposition that there shouldn't be pleasant vices. And you can kind of, in that next page, there's this whole other juxtaposition talking about Othello said, if after every tempest came such calms, may the winds blow till they have awakened death. And like, it's funny because both the Savage and Mond are talking about juxtapositions, but in such a vastly different way that like we need, for the Savage, you need the storm that leads the rainbow, right? If we're going to turn this to some sort of cliche, trite nonsense. And Mustafa Mond is saying, well, we need vices that are pleasant in order to keep people moving. And so they're all talking through juxtapositions, which Empson would have had a field day with. He wrote a whole book called 7 Types of Ambiguity, and there's an entire chapter dedicated to juxtapositional phrases in text and how they bring out what's the phrase here? Bring out the author's own divisiveness in their brain when they can't. I can't read my own damn handwriting. When they're not sure what they're saying and they don't find the point until they've already written it. And that's what he thinks juxtapositions are. And I think that's interesting to think that this book is so full of them. Is it possible? I don't think it's possible for Huxley to have done it on accident, obviously, right? And so I wonder if Huxley was wrestling with these ideas, purposefully making them juxtapositions, or if that's just how they came out through the writing, I guess. I don't know. Half-baked.
I think it's got to be intentional. I think he's so satirical and hyperbolic with everything. And I feel bad demeaning your question with this simple answer, but it had to be.
Yeah, I don't think it demeans the question. I think with it being so frequent, I don't think how it can be an accident. But I'm wondering if it started intentionally or if it's something that he discovered as he was writing and then was moving in through it. Ooh, we only have 10 minutes left on this call, which means
we did 30 minutes.
Ah, we did it.
30 minutes.
We did it again, y'all.
Sorry.
It's a 40-minute limit meeting. We have 10 minutes left.
Oopsie doodles.
Well, I guess we probably have only been recording for 25 of those minutes.
Maybe.
I don't think that 5 minutes makes it any better.
No, I don't think so.
A closing one-word answer question.
Yeah.
I had
One
a
word.
quote. You're no fun.
Oh, okay. After my one-word answer question, you can leave us with a closing quote. This is how we end up going on for too long. So if we look at it as a competition between these two ideals that are discussed in chapter 16, Mond, John, who won? Based on the outcome of this book, who was correct? Mustafa Mond, John the Savage?
Mond.
Savage.
Mond. Look at that. All right, give us your closing quote, Landon.
Mond parts with probably my favorite quote from the book, beyond I want sin. Mond responds to John saying, but God doesn't change. To which Mon says, men do though. John says, what difference does that make? Mon looks at him and says, all the difference in the world.